Okay, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So I do want to just introduce myself and kind of give you a little bit background on myself, as well as why this topic is something I choose to speak about. So again, my name is Mallory Henry. I'm a senior coordinator of education for Caron Treatment Centers. Prior to working at Caron, I worked doing in-home family-based mental health care. And then prior to that, my undergraduate work is in education. So one of the reasons I love my position is because I get to educate just in a different way. I talked a little bit about kind of some of the things I do for Caron. One of them is facilitate a sibling support group. I also have done webinars on how do we support the other children in the home when there is someone struggling with a substance use disorder. And that is really a big passion of mine, is working with family members. But I always say, like, the other half of my role is working with adolescents and families. And which brings me to tonight's topic in terms of the marijuana landscape. One of the roles I play within our department is to be the quote unquote resident expert on cannabis. It is something I'm super passionate about in terms of prevention and education, because I think, especially working with youth, working with parents, there is a lot of mixed messages around marijuana that we see right now. In terms of the family system, when I work with family members, it's often a point of confusion. How do we have a child who's addicted to marijuana, right? So when I was young, that was not something you could be addicted to. How is my loved one ending up in treatment now for marijuana? When I see that as a substance who's maybe not super addictive. So some of those questions have come up from family members. Are they going to be welcome in 12-step meetings? What does it look like to seek treatment for a marijuana use disorder? So I wanted to put together a presentation to kind of encapsulate all of those things related to what the marijuana landscape looks like in terms of what are we seeing with marijuana? So what does it look like? What is actually the nitty-gritty details of what the cannabis plant is and the intoxicating effects of that? What is some research we know in terms of physical and mental health implications and consequences? And then lastly, what does it look like to seek treatment? And what are we seeing in treatment in terms of people who are coming in using marijuana in terms of legal, not legal, decriminalized, things like that. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. But I just wanted you to have a little bit of a background on why this is something I find really interesting and why I think it's really relevant for family members. So for those of you who are joining us who are not familiar with Caron, and we're going to not skip that page. Caron is a nonprofit treatment facility. We have been doing drug and alcohol and behavioral health treatment for over 65 years. That is pretty unprecedented in the world of behavioral health. Our Education Alliance, so the department in which I fall, have been doing education for over 30 years for Caron. So prevention education has been a passion for Caron a very long time, nearly half of the existence of Caron. So it is a very large department at Caron. We actually span up and down the East Coast, trying to provide education to students, family members, and youth-serving professionals. Caron has headquarters is in Berks County, Pennsylvania. That is where our founding inpatient facility is. And then we also have two facilities in Florida, as well as regional offices kind of up and down the East Coast. So there's a recovery center in New York City. We have an office in Philadelphia, an office in Arlington, Virginia, and Atlanta, Georgia. And now it doesn't want to go to the next slide. There we go. So just kind of what we'll cover. Again, we'll start by reviewing cannabis facts and statistics. So really looking at what is this substance now versus what was it 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. We'll talk about current research. So really looking at what research do we have around cannabis and how does that inform how we talk about it, how we treat it, how we provide prevention messaging around it. And then finally, kind of talking about how do we understand treatment and recovery approaches to cannabis, because it does look potentially a little bit different than a substance like alcohol per se. So we'll talk about maybe what some of those differences look like. So let's talk about cannabis in general. So I like to start by, you've probably already heard me going back and forth between the term marijuana and the term cannabis, right? And that is kind of confusing. We see that now kind of in media and in culture related to what we're seeing. But cannabis is actually the genus of the plants Okay, so the term itself, cannabis, is actually the name of the plant. Okay, we'll talk about how we got marijuana from there. But when we talk about the taxonomy of the plant, the genus of the plant is cannabis, and that's where that term cannabis comes from. There are different types of cannabis, so there are different species of cannabis, which we will talk about. There is sativa, there is indica, there is ruderalis. Those are the three species that we know of the cannabis plant. Right? So that's why you'll hear me use the word, and I prefer to use the word cannabis because it's more encompassing of what we're seeing versus just using the word marijuana, right? The word cannabis really kind of explains that we put all products derived from the cannabis plant, usually specifically the sativa plant, just because that's the most known, but really any of the species we can consider cannabis. The cannabis plant we know has hundreds and hundreds of chemical substances. We don't know much about most of them. Some of the research I'll say, you might hear me say, especially if you ask a question, we don't have a lot of research on that yet. Cannabis right now, whether it is legal in certain states or not, it is still federally an illegal substance. Okay, it is still federally through the Food and Drug Administration and the DEA a Schedule 1 substance. There is talk about that being switched, but currently it is Schedule 1. What that means for us federally is that there are no known medical properties for cannabis, and it has a potential for addiction. Okay, that is what Schedule 1 means, and that has not changed even with legalization. That's why legalization gets a little hairy if you're in a state where it's legal. So I'm in Pennsylvania. We have medically legalized cannabis. You cannot use a credit card to purchase cannabis in any state that it's legal because you can't use a credit card to purchase a federally illegal substance. Right? If you go to open a cannabis dispensary, you can't use assets. You have to have liquid cash in order to put money down on that because you can't use credit to sell a federally illegal substance, right? So it gets a little hairy in there, but I just wanted you to kind of understand where that Schedule 1 comes from because you'll hear that in the news right now. There's just been a couple stories the last couple months of pushing to reschedule cannabis because if it's rescheduled, it will be easier to access, right? The word marijuana, so the word we know of when we think about cannabis, marijuana refers to parts of the plant. So in 1937, the United States attempted to kind of separate out marijuana, which was the intoxicating piece of the cannabis plant, versus the other parts of the plant that could potentially be used for textiles. So what we did was said anything that has a THC content, and we'll talk more about THC, of higher percentages, we will consider marijuana. And the term marijuana actually came because they wanted to make it sound quote unquote dirty so that Americans didn't use it. So they named it something that sounds Mexican. If you actually read into some of the history of the word marijuana, that is what you will find. So that is why we're kind of transitioning to saying cannabis because it's just more all encompassing of anything that comes from the cannabis plant versus just the parts we know that are intoxicating. Okay, there are 4 strains of cannabis. So we have indica, we have sativa, we have ruderalis. Those are species of the cannabis plant. Okay, a hybrid means a mix between any of these. Okay, so a strain is what we consider something that would be intoxicating, right? That contains one or more of these species of cannabis. And we'll get into that a little bit more too. Here is kind of just a generic, we could talk about strains of cannabis for days on end. I think it's really fascinating in terms of cannabis strains. The most popular strains in the United States in terms of consumption are sativa, indica, and a hybrid of sativa and indica. Okay, so meaning growing those plants together so that we get properties of both species of the indica and the sativa plant. Sativa is more of it's technically a taller plant. It needs a little bit more sunlight in order to grow. It's found in different parts of the world, naturally occurring than the indica plant. And the sativa plant and the sativa variety is more of a stimulating effect. So sativa, you can see here, it'll say like a cerebral high or an uplifting effect, right? These actually come from, and a lot of stuff I pull is from like legal dispensaries, things like that. So you can kind of see how it's being marketed. But sativa, we know, is more of a stimulating effect. So if you're like me and you grow up and you learn about marijuana, I remember learning that marijuana is a depressant and it slows you down, right? I never heard of marijuana as a stimulant. And that's because most of what we had in our country pre-legalization was the indica species of cannabis. We didn't have much sativa. To be honest, most people would say if I got sativa, that was a bad high, right? It wasn't a high that made me feel relaxed. It was a high that made me feel paranoid and anxious. And that's what we see with sativa, okay? Indica, the way I remember indica is actually, I say indicouch. That's how we remember indica. Indica is the depressant of the species of cannabis. It is more of a sedative. It's more relaxing. And it's being marketed, as you can see here, to reduce pain, limit anxiety, help sleep. This is a shorter growing plant, more stocky leaves. You can see in the picture here, grows in more colder climates than we see with the sativa in terms of naturally growing plants. Neither of these grow naturally in the United States, okay, just to be clear about that. Indica, again, more of a depressing effect in terms of how indica affects the brain and body. And then hybrids are a mixture of sativa and indica. So if you were to go to a dispensary or a place that sells legal adult use cannabis, you would see something like hybrid 60% sativa, 40% indica, okay? Meaning that 60% of the effect is going to be a stimulating effect, 40% of that effect is going to be more of a depressing effect. The interesting thing about this is that there's no research on how the hybrid strains affect the brain and body. It's more people using them and then self-reporting how they felt while they were on the marijuana. And that is kind of where we get these hybrids from. So if you're to go on any sort of website that's selling cannabis, you're going to see a lot of hybrids. It's a very popular thing to have kind of a sativa and indica blend, right? So you can see here even have roughly almost 780 strains, over half of them are a hybrid. So you can kind of see here some of the strains and what their names are as well. So if you were to go to a dispensary, you're going to see things like sour diesel, Girl Scout cookies, right? So also just kind of taking into account what that marketing looks like, right? We'll talk a little bit more about that, but there's very little restrictions on marketing when it comes to cannabis, and very few states have ever implemented laws regarding marketing, even when they've legalized cannabis. So a lot of states are trying to backtrack and saying, oh my goodness, we can't have, I was just at a conference where a man from Arizona was saying that they have billboards for cannabis. And right outside of school, there was a billboard of Santa Claus using a marijuana product. And the state kind of was like, whoops, maybe we should have put some restrictions on marketing for that of who we're marketing to, because legally kids can't use cannabis. So another question that comes up is, we have cannabis, we know what marijuana is, but what is hemp, right? So hemp, because you'll see things like if you go to a store that sells like lotion, you're going to see a lotion that says like hemp product, right? And some people are, it might have like a pot leaf on it, and people are like, how's that being legally sold in Target? So in 2018, so actually very recently, we passed in the United States the Agriculture Improvement Act, or what's known as the Farm Bill of 2018. And that basically said that if a cannabis plant has under 3.3%, it can be considered hemp, and hemp can be used as a textile or a material. Right, so you can use parts of the cannabis plant that do not contain THC to produce things like body lotion or rope or paper, things like that. And that basically allowed them to use the cannabis plant in terms of a textile. What that also did was create some loopholes for things like strains of cannabis that might have less than 0.3%, but could potentially be intoxicating or dangerous because they might contain other cannabinoids. So we'll talk a little bit about that. For those of you in Pennsylvania, we'll see things like a store down the street from me was selling Delta 8 Delta 8 is a cannabinoid, but technically, legally, Delta 8 contains less than 0.3%. So that can legally be sold at a gas station. It doesn't have to follow the dispensary laws because it's actually considered, quote unquote, you're going to see me doing a lot of air quotes here, hemp, not marijuana. Okay, so just wanted to kind of give that differential because it is a little bit confusing. These are some of the things that the hemp can be used for. So we see it used in things like milk, protein powders, hemp seeds are really popular to put in like protein smoothies, things like that. I want to be clear though, that if it is hemp, as directed by the FDA, it does not contain an intoxicating effect, right? The problem is when we see some of those loopholes being pushed where things are not going through the FDA. The FDA actually won't touch marijuana legally because it's a Schedule I substance. So they actually won't touch it in terms of legalization or saying it's healthy or not. So they don't, even if it's an edible strain of cannabis, it doesn't have to have like a food label on it because it's not going through the FDA. A lot of people don't realize that alcohol actually doesn't go through the FDA in the United States. It goes through the Tobacco, Alcohol, and Firearms, which does not have the same food labels as the FDA does. So we tend to push kind of things that maybe in reality, if you were to think about it, I kind of say this a lot, if the FDA were to look at alcohol, they would probably not approve it for consumption because we know how damaging it can be to the brain and body. So we kind of have it over here in a separate entity in the United States. But I just wanted you to see a little bit about what hemp looks like because it does come up sometimes of like, how can that be in a store? So you heard me talk about THC. My computer does not like me today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what is THC. Okay, THC, oh my goodness. THC stands for tetrahydrocannabinol. Tetrahydrocannabinol is, my mouse does not want to work today. Tetrahydrocannabinol, I'm going to stop sharing for a second, but I'll keep talking. Tetrahydrocannabinol is the intoxicating effect of chemical within the cannabis plant. It is the only chemical we know to be right now that we know is intoxicating. We don't really know anything else about many other strains, except, I'm just changing my settings here, except that we know that THC is mind altering. Go back to sharing here. Okay. Oh my goodness. It does not want to work for me. The cannabis plant we know now has been genetically engineered. I'm just going to have to keep pushing back on this slide. Genetically engineered to have more THC than ever before. The interesting thing about THC is that it's what we call lipophilic. Lipophilic means that it binds to fat cells in our body, specifically fat cells that house our organs. Okay, that means it's fat soluble. So that means it can be in our system much longer than we feel the high. Okay, so I saw a question come in that I'll address then of like, how long can cannabis stay in your system? Because it lives within our fat cells within our body, we have to actually wait until we metabolize those fat cells out. And everyone's body is slightly different in how it does that until it's actually out of our body. And you can see here that cannabis or THC affects multiple parts of our brain, movement, memory, coordination. So it's specifically impacting a lot of our body and our brain when we have THC in it. I'm going to stop. Sorry, guys. I'm going to stop sharing for a second and let me see if I can fix this so that you can actually see a slide.
Can I ask a quick question about the Delta 8?
Please do.
You said something about Delta 8, and
yes.
I was confused about that because you said that was hemp, or it was less than 0.3% cannabis. So, or what is the impact then on using Delta 8 in terms of like the high or the effect on the body of the Delta 8? That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, it's a great question. And to be honest, this is one of those that I'm saying we don't have a lot of research on Delta 8. We know that Delta 8 has quote unquote less of an intoxicating effect than 9. These are our kind of numbers. You'll also see Delta 10 being sold out there. Delta 10 is through that loophole as well. From some research, we think Delta 10 has more than Delta 8, but we know that Delta 9 is what we consider marijuana. That is what we know produces an intoxicating effect. We don't know much about Delta 8 and Delta 9 right now. What we do know that is a lot of the stuff that's sold as Delta 8 and Delta 9 contains a lot of other chemicals, partly because it could be synthetic, could be mixed together with a bunch of other stuff, and that we are seeing some side effects from that, like in terms of mental health concerns. We're seeing things like in terms of physical health concerns, just because we have people putting things in their body that just don't belong, quite honestly, in bodies, in terms of what that Delta 8 looks like. So it's a good question that I wish we had more research on. I always kind of say with a lot of this stuff, we're kind of in a guinea pig era right now. It's kind of like cigarettes were when they first came out. It's being touted as kind of this thing that can fix a lot of things. But with long-term research, we're probably going to see that maybe it's not as healthy as a lot of people think. But that's a great question. The only really information we know is that the FDA did put out a statement on Delta 8 saying that it's not healthy and it's not safe, and that they were seeing people quote unquote overdose on things like Delta 8. And that's really the only thing we have right now in terms of information. But it's a good question, of course. Okay, I think I fixed it, so it's not going to keep skipping ahead on me. Somehow I pushed it that it was skipping ahead. So I also want to talk about CBD, because you'll hear about THC and you'll hear about CBD. Okay, these are the cannabinoids you'll hear the most about. CBD stands for cannabidiol. So cannabidiol itself also falls under the loophole. Cannabidiol does not produce an intoxicating effect if it is pure CBD. It is under 0.3%, and therefore it is considered a hemp product through the 2018 Farm Bill Act, and it can be sold anywhere, right? So I know for me, it can be sold at the gas station, it can be sold at the hairdressers, it can be sold at a food place. I'm again in Pennsylvania. We were down at the Jersey Shore last year, and my son ordered a piece of cinnamon roll, like a monkey bread type thing, and they were like, "Would you like CBD drizzled on top of it?" Right? So you can kind of see it everywhere. And we don't have a ton of research on CBD either. It is another strain or another cannabinoid that we just don't know a lot about. We know that it's not psychoactive if it is pure. Unfortunately, a lot of what's sold is not being monitored for pureness, right? So it could have high levels of THC. We just don't know that, right? Until it's potentially too late. Okay. We do know that the Food and Drug Administration, so the FDA has legalized something called Epidiolex that's been around for a long time. Epidiolex is a synthetically produced, so a lab produced CBD, that's pure CBD, that is used to treat types of seizures in the United States. And that's been around for a long time. That's nothing new, but that is lab created CBD, not anything coming from an actual cannabis plant. You're going to hear things like CBD is effective for anxiety. It's effective for sleep. It's effective for dogs who don't like fireworks. You're going to see things about CBD all over the place. And again, we just don't have much research on people who've only used CBD. And also we don't have a lot of, we have really no testing in terms of, is it really CBD or does it have something else in it? I've worked with people before who thought they were taking pure CBD. I actually had a school teacher tell me that he was suffering from really intense vertigo and had tried lots of things. And a doctor had recommended CBD in lieu of some other pharmacological interventions, and he had tried it. And ended up having severe anxiety that he never had before, actually ended up having a panic attack, ended up in the emergency room. And when they did a toxicology screen, he screened positive for THC. He was under the assumption that he was only using CBD, but that CBD actually had levels of THC in it, right? So I do think it'll be interesting when we get more research on it, because what I kind of think about is it the CBD that's helping people sleep, or is it low levels of THC, right? And we just don't know that yet. Right? So these are just some pictures of some of the stuff you'll see in terms of CBD. I tried to pull images from actual dispensaries, things like that. I wanted to talk a little bit about methods of consumption. So how are people using cannabis, because this gets a little interesting as well. Because I think if you're an adult, most of us go to this top left picture here when we think about cannabis. We think about what we consider flower cannabis or bud cannabis, which is what I would say like the dried green stuff, right? And that is not what most people we see, especially adolescents, young adults, that's not what we see them using. I actually just met with a student today who, when I asked what type of cannabis they were using, they were like, there's other kinds other than cartridges. So they actually only knew of a cartridge, which I'll show you in a minute. They didn't even know that other types of cannabis exist as a 17-year-old, okay? So you can see here a joint, which is flower cannabis wrapped in a piece of paper. A bowl would be heated by adding heat to the bottom, inhaling kind of the whatever remnants from the cannabis. A blunt is loose flower marijuana wrapped in a tobacco leaf, all right, or a cigar wrap. A bong and a bubbler are basically THC, so flower cannabis heated by water. And then you'll see people make kind of bongs and bubblers out of lots of different things, an apple, a honey jar, a water bottle, things like that. So when we talk about flower marijuana, street marijuana today, in terms of flower marijuana, so what I say is sold in the street, not legally, is averaging about a potency of 20%. I want you to keep that in mind because we're going to talk about potency in a minute. But 20% is very potent compared to what we're used to with THC. So edibles is another form of consumption. We in Pennsylvania, for me, we do not have edibles legalized in terms of medical as of now. That could change. But in a lot of states, we do see edibles legalized, whether that's medicinally or for adult use. So you can kind of see here, I actually took these pictures directly from a national chain who sells cannabis products online. I just took screenshots of their website to show you what some of these edibles look like. Because I just wanted you to see some of the marketing, okay? So you can see here that these are actually edibles, right? So a serving size typically is like one gummy, right? One piece of Skittle, one Jolly Rancher, right? And you can see here they're marketed to look very similar to candy, okay? Most of them are some sort of gummy. These are like seltzers that have THC in them. So when we think about THC, if your visual is that joint, right? This is what kids think of when they think of cannabis. They think of products like this that are heavily marketed, really well marketed, and taste good, right? So they taste like a, Sour Patch Kid. The other thing that we see, unfortunately, when you see marketing like this and packaging like this, is we see a lot of toxicity for children, right? So if, someone had legally purchased something like Stony Patch, right? So these Sour Patch Kids, and left them on the kitchen counter and a child finds them, right? I have 2 children. They're not going to eat one Sour Patch Kid, right? They're going to eat the whole bag of Sour Patch Kids and probably overdose on cannabis, right? And end up in the emergency room. So we did see in states where legalization, we see a significant increase in hospitalizations because of overuse of cannabis or overdoses of children, right? Just because of where they can find it. So in terms of vaping and cartridges, this is what I run into the most with our young adults and adolescents. This is again a screenshot from a national dispensary. They are selling they're basically selling cartridges or vape devices, just like people would use for nicotine, but pre-filled with some sort of strain, right? So it actually looks like an oil inside. It almost looks like an amber colored wax or oil. And they come pre-filled or in like little jars that you can fill yourself. And you can see here kind of what they look like, what they're sold as. Like this one's sold as rainbow sherbet. Okay, so again, just kind of looking at some of that marketing. And they can also put them on sale. So Leaf Fly is a very popular national chain. You'll see ads for them pop up, but they will sell, like they had a sale the day I took the screenshot, 20% off vapes and cartridges. And so the other thing with this is even in states where it's legalized for adults, it's 21 and over, right? But buying things online gets a little questionable because the only thing I had to do to get into this website was click, yes, I'm over the age of 21. Okay, I didn't have to put a license, I didn't have to take a picture or anything like that. And you can see here that the potency of these products is significant, right? So remember I said the flower cannabis, 20%. Some of these pens will come into 90, 99%, right? So I'll talk again a little bit more about potency, but I just want you to see kind of what some of these things look like. So in terms of potency, I want you to take a look here. Potency of naturally occurring sativa and indica plants, so where they grow naturally in the world, is less than 1% THC. So when people say like, but it grows naturally, because I get that a lot from adolescents, I'm like, it grows naturally at a 0.5% THC, right? That is significant, like very, very low levels of THC. When we started to see in the 1970s, we started to see a lot of indica come to the United States, you know, being grown maybe in the backyard, right? We started to see an increase of THC. So we got to about 3%. What happened was where there's demand for higher THC, there's engineers looking on how do we modify a plant and genetic structure in order to get higher level THC. So in the 1970s, or the Woodstock weed, we looked at about 1 to 3% THC, most of which was indica, okay? Now, when we look at flower cannabis, the average is 23%, right? So even with flower cannabis, this is a vastly different substance. I often kind of say to parents a lot when I'm working with them, like if kids are smoking 23% marijuana, if they were to get their hands on the marijuana of the 1970s, they probably wouldn't even feel it. Because if they're used to 23%, what is 1%? Now, when we look at concentrates, so this would be those cartridges and those oils, right? Often those oils are also what's used to make edibles. You're going to see upwards of 99%, right? So if the Woodstock weed was 1%, 1 to 3%, and now we're seeing 99%, this is a very different substance. So when people will say to me, how is my child in need of inpatient treatment using solely marijuana? That can't be the case, right? It can be because of potency, right? We did not see people enter treatment with cannabis use as their only substance use 20 years ago, right? I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it wasn't a majority of patients. It is very commonly a drug of choice of patients now, and is a reason people enter inpatient treatment, because 99% is a different substance. It's not the same substance. We also have a significant increase in consumption. So how much people are using cannabis in our country, right? So here's an analogy, right? So if before, right? So before legalization, before commercialization, so before marketing, right? It would be about one person drinking, you know, a can of soda, right? 20 years ago, to now them drinking 33 16-ounce cappuccinos a day. So instead of drinking one soda, 33 16-ounce cappuccinos. And that's just looking at consumption. So it's looking at when people are using cannabis, we also know that they're using significantly more than they did 20 years ago. Okay, so higher potency and more chronic use. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about research. I mentioned that we don't have a ton, and we don't, okay? I really wish we had more, but I did want to share with you some studies. I work in conjunction with one of our directors of training at Caron, and we share research back and forth. So we make sure that it's looked at through a medical lens as well with our medical director. So all of these are studies that they have shared with me. I am not a doctor. I can't speak to research, but I can speak to kind of what we're seeing come from the research, right? So one of the facts, and I always say stick with facts when we talk with people about marijuana, is that we have no research of it being effectively used to successfully treat mood disorders. So things like anxiety, depression. There is no research that shows that it is effective, okay? Quite contrary, we actually see the exact opposite, right? We found that every single psychiatric malady, anxiety, depression, social phobia, panic, was made worse by marijuana. Okay. So a lot of times it was like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Did the anxiety come first or the cannabis, right? And what we're seeing really now, research is showing us that use of cannabis, specifically chronically, according to ASAM, which is the Academy of Addiction Medicine, says 3 to 5 times a week. Right. And I think that's really interesting because in states where we have medical cannabis, so like for me in Pennsylvania, medical implies, especially if it's a recommendation from a doctor, it typically implies daily use, right? You don't take your blood pressure medication like when you want to, right? You take it every day because your body needs it to be healthy, right? So it's a mixed message we're sending people to. You need it daily, but yet all of our research says that chronic use of cannabis is even 3 to 5 times a week, not even daily. So some of this we're looking at in this research, it will say like chronic use. That's looking at someone who doesn't even use every day. Okay. There also tend to be using research with low levels of potency as well, right? So not 99%, right? Again, marijuana exacerbates psychiatric issues. We actually saw a study come out in 2020 in JAMA Psychiatry that looked at over 400,000 cases of depression among teens in the United States, and they said that they can be attributed to marijuana use. Okay. So again, I will send you all of these slides, and then at the end of the presentation, I also put where these studies came from as well. So if you're interested in that. Okay. Professor at Brown, they followed over more than 350 veterans, and they found that frequent cannabis use worsened trauma-related intrusion symptoms, right? Or created like upsetting nightmares, things like that, which is interesting because we do see it pushed for legalization in terms of use for vets. So that's just an interesting study. A really interesting study came out of New Zealand that looked at cognitive impairment for people who used cannabis chronically under the age of 25 and showed a long-term use associated in a change in IQ, right? So we also saw teenagers who were using cannabis drop potential up to 6 points in their IQ due to use of cannabis. And partly we think that's because cannabis significantly impacts your hippocampus. Your hippocampus is where short-term and long-term memories are stored. It makes those short-term memories come in as slightly fuzzy. And we know that your learning depends a lot on memory, right? So if your short-term memories are coming in fuzzy, we're probably not learning at a rate that we should be, right? So again, this is an interesting study coming out that we share with a lot of people. Right? We also know that non-disordered cannabis use, meaning something that wouldn't be relevant for treatment among adolescents, so meaning use here and there, is associated with adverse psychological effects. A study of 68,000 adolescents, approximately 4 times more common than cannabis use disorder. So basically that means using here and there is typically more common than chronic use or daily use. But that does mean whether they used it daily and met criteria for cannabis use disorder, which I'll show you in a bit, or they used here and there, it didn't change the fact that it increased their odds for adverse psychological effects. So things like anxiety, depression. And that's coming from a 2023 study. It also says that teenagers who use cannabis recreationally are 2 to 4 times more likely to develop things like anxiety, depression, suicidality, even if they didn't have those things before they started using substances. Young men are the highest risk of schizophrenia linked with cannabis use disorder. As many as 30% of cases of schizophrenia among men 21 to 30 may have been prevented by not using cannabis. So we are seeing, I've been in a lot of family sessions. I've worked with family members who have lost children due to schizophrenic or a psychotic episode due to using high potency cannabis. We know that all of our brains have kind of a threshold for psychosis. We know that cannabis use can lower that threshold, right? So we know there's a genetic history in there. If psychosis or schizophrenia runs in a family, it can lower that threshold. And the scary thing is that schizophrenia is a diagnosis that lasts the rest of your life. It's not something that happens and you come out of, right? So people can have psychotic episodes that could potentially lead to a schizophrenia diagnosis, meaning that that psychosis doesn't go away. Right. And that's really scary. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing at Caron, because what we are seeing is a lot of psychosis based on marijuana, especially when we were treating teens. A very significant amount of teens were coming in with cannabis use-induced psychosis. Right. So again, I'll send the PowerPoint so you have all those resources at your disposal. But I just wanted to kind of share some statistics with you. Again, we don't have a ton of research, but what we do have does not look very promising, right? It's actually really scary when we look at some of the research. So I also want to look at, what does this look like, right? We have it, we have people using it. What does this look like in terms of clinical and treatment? So I did pull some numbers from Caron. I just wanted you to see this because I think a lot of times people think people come into treatment for drugs like heroin, right? Or drugs like opioids, right? And yes, we do see that. But I wanted you to see, so this is looking at 2020, 21, 21, 22, and 23. So full years. This is patients who came into Caron's inpatient settings. So not looking at outpatient, strictly looking at Florida and Pennsylvania inpatient, and what their drug of choice was. Now, I do want to preface that you can have multiple drugs of choice, right? So a patient coming into Caron can say, I use cannabis and I use alcohol, or I use cannabis and I use opioids. But I just wanted you to see that cannabis is actually the number 2 drug of choice for patients at Caron. So these are patients seeking inpatient treatment, right? So a lot of people are shocked by this when I talk about this, because people are like, I really thought things like opioids would be higher, right? And they're on there, right? They are, but we also see a lot of cannabis use, whether that's solely a drug of choice or whether that's a drug that they also use. But the top 2 substances, right? So alcohol is legal, and we see cannabis being more frequently legalized, right? So those 2 are still the top reasons that people seek treatment. So just something interesting to think about. And again, in terms of what are we seeing at Caron clinically? Kind of what everyone kind of has been telling me that we're seeing clinically is, we're seeing people who are defending cannabis use, or saying like, I'll get clean and sober from this, but I'm not going to get clean and sober from cannabis. If you've ever heard of California sober, that is actually saying I'm going to stop using all substances except marijuana, right? So that California sober, that's what that means. And you'll hear that in things like the media. I was just watching something a couple weeks ago where someone said, oh, I thought you were California sober with some celebrity, meaning that they only use marijuana, right? So we do see people might say like they're hesitant to disclose cannabis use because they don't want that to be taken away from them. So someone asked, do the numbers include synthetic cannabis? So basically, we don't differentiate necessarily. We will just ask, what are your drugs of choice, right? So synthetic or not synthetic, it would be placed under cannabis. That's a good question. We also see a lot of misconceptions around use, right? It's not that bad. It's okay if I still use cannabis as long as I'm not doing heroin, right? We see people come in with medical marijuana cards. So in states where it's legalized, right? In Pennsylvania, we see that a lot, right? I need it because it treats my anxiety, right? So what at Caron, right? We want to get a patient off everything to see how the anxiety presents, and then look at medical interventions that we know work with long-term research. We don't have that with cannabis. Right. We also see some withdrawal, right? I'll talk to you about withdrawal looks like. Withdrawal doesn't tend to look the same as other substances, and this is why it gets tricky to get insurance to cover treatment for cannabis use disorder, because we don't see an abrupt withdrawal, meaning you're not going to die from withdrawal of cannabis. And remember, that's because it slowly weans itself out of your body based on fat cells. Right. So someone could still have cannabis in their system 30, 60, 90 days later, even if they haven't used. Now, if we're doing blood tests and urine screens, we can make sure the level's going down, right? That means they haven't used recently, but it doesn't mean there's not THC still in their system. And ultimately what we see is, right, they're using cannabis as a way to find relief, right? I often say, people are using drugs because they're trying to find a sense of relief, right? From whatever that internal struggle is, right? The student I was meeting with today said that they couldn't sleep and they had a lot of racing thoughts at night, and that is what they felt like cannabis helped them with. Right? But can we get them connected to someone who can talk to them about what other possibilities there are to, in terms of mindfulness, meditation, things like that for someone who's a teenager? So the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, so this is what psychologists and psychiatrists use to diagnose mental health conditions, does lay out criteria for a cannabis use disorder. So you will see alcohol use disorder, you will see substance use disorder, you will see cannabis use disorder, you will see opioid use disorder. So this is cannabis use disorder. So this is what we're looking at to make a diagnosis of a cannabis use disorder. And then it goes by severity. So you can see here at the bottom, based on how many bullet points you have. So if you have 2 to 3, you have a mild cannabis use disorder, 4 to 5, moderate, more than 6, severe, right? So that's how it's kind of modulated. And you can kind of see here, like unable to stop, used for longer periods in larger amounts. So we're seeing increased tolerance. We're seeing concerns around school, work, family obligations, a decrease in recreational friendships, repeated use even when the situation's dangerous, driving under the influence, right? Withdrawal, right? So seeing those withdrawal effects. So I wanted you to see what this looks like, because this is what clinicians would look at in order to make a diagnosis of a cannabis use disorder. You can Google DSM criteria and it will pop up. But I just wanted you to see what this looks like. And I also wanted you to see what the DSM says in terms of withdrawal, because we also look at withdrawal symptoms. And they now lay out criteria for withdrawal, because some pushback we get from people is like, but you're not going to die from withdrawal of cannabis, so it can't be all that bad. I don't need treatment, right, for this, because I'm not going to die of the withdrawal, right? But we now have criteria for that withdrawal. We have 3 or more of them is considered withdrawal. So irritability, anxiety, sleep difficulty, restlessness, decreased appetite, depressed mood. Right? Now, I want to be clear here. This is the part that gets a little tricky, and we'll talk about this when we talk about treatment, is insurance companies, in terms of withdrawal, often don't want to pay for inpatient treatment if the withdrawal is manageable on its own. And if you see here, none of these things are going to be physically really terrible for someone. And that is why we have a lot of trouble getting people into treatment with marijuana use, because these withdrawal, while notable, are not something that needs to be medically managed, right? Now, I'll tell you, that's not what we're seeing and believe at Caron, but that is, we don't see necessarily a lot of insurance companies kind of caught up to the fact that marijuana can be addictive and that there is specific withdrawal noted. Right. So in terms of ASAM criteria, so the American Society of Addiction Medicine, we look at the DSM in terms of diagnosis, but we also look at dimensions in terms of an assessment. So if you've ever had a child, a family member go to what's called a level of care assessment, I wanted to show you what we look at, right? So we look at 6 dimensions and we look at their substance use within those dimensions. So we look at withdrawal, right? Is it there? What is the extent of it? Does it need to be medically managed, right? This is also what's looked at through insurance. We look at biomedical conditions. Do they have a medical condition that's being exacerbated or at risk by using the substance, right? So if I have a kid in front of me who has, like for alcohol, we would say if they have liver damage and they're still drinking, right, that's a medical concern, right? So something like that's smokable, like cannabis, if they had severe asthma and continued to smoke cannabis, right? Dimension 3 is the mental health or the behavioral health component. So we look at how are they managing their thoughts, emotions, mental health, right? And this is where we see a lot of that co-occurring, right? So we see a lot of people that have significant mental health concerns and significant substance use, and they're kind of intertwined, especially with cannabis. We see that a lot. Dimension 4, we look at readiness to change. Do they want to, right? Are they saying, I want to stop, but I can't? Right? Or are they saying, I don't have a problem, I'm good? Right? We look at relapse, right? So what is their potential, right? I'll have people say to me, you know, I'm not using right now, or I'm using right now, but I'm going to stop in a couple days, right? And then it comes a couple days and they don't. Or I'll have people say like, I'm only going to use marijuana until I graduate college, right? So where are they in terms of that relapse potential? And then dimension 6, this is where the family comes in. We look at the recovery environment. So we look at, are they in a situation, a living situation where they have support, right? Are they surrounded by people, places, and things that will support non-use, or are they surrounded by people, places, and things that support use? So, right. So what do your friends use substances? Does your significant other or partner use substances? Do your parents use substances? Are they in the home? We also look at, do family members, can they do their own work around systems, right? So can they look at themselves and say, what do I need to change in order to help support this person in recovery? So I wanted to show you what that looks like, because I think it does get a little confusing when we're differentiating between, does someone need treatment and how is insurance going to cover it? Right. So when we talk about that criteria, the levels of care here are in this image. So based on what's shared with us by the individual, and if they're getting a level of care assessment at a facility, so like at Caron, they are going to do like a urine screen to make sure that what's in the urine is matching what they're telling us, right? So if they say like, I haven't smoked weed in 6 years, but yet THC shows up in their urine, we might question what they're saying, right? But you can see here the levels of care we have for treatment. Right. So early intervention is typically what we're seeing and my team does in schools. So we might run a group of students who've used cannabis who need some education so that they don't continue to use. Right. Outpatient would be in a clinical setting where they meet with a therapist who helps them potentially cut down on use. Intensive outpatient or IOP, 3 to 5 times a week. And we are going to have a webinar upcoming where we kind of go through what we call the ABCs. So IOP, OP, ADD, yeah, all these things where we go through, what does that look like? What does all this mean in terms of treatment? But I did want you to know that when we look at intensive outpatient, so they're still living at home, but they're getting intense counseling. And inpatient services, this is where we also often have to convince insurance that it's necessary in terms of treatment. We usually don't have trouble with outpatient, but insurance looks at what they consider medical necessity when it decides to cover substance use treatment. Marijuana, cocaine, some other drugs that don't need medical detox. Remember when we talked about that withdrawal? So we said that they don't medically need to be monitored. They don't need medication. They don't need 24-hour doctors. It makes it tough to get an inpatient level of care approved through insurance than it would for like alcohol or benzodiazepine, something like a Xanax, because that actually requires medical detox. So that is often why if you've tried to get a child or a loved one into treatment for marijuana, the insurance company could say you need to try a lower level of care first because we don't think it's medically necessary. Okay. So at Caron, we know that cannabis is addictive. We know that it can warrant IOP or inpatient care, but we also know that insurance hasn't always caught up with that. So what we say to families is be prepared for denials from insurance, but we have a lot of ways in order to ask certain questions to get information as a way to build a case for coverage. But sometimes we do have to say you need to start at a lower level of care to prove that you need a higher level of care. So I like to put this in here because I do think a lot of family members struggle because they see the concerns in their children, they see their concerns in their loved one, but then they have an insurance company saying they don't need that. Right. And that can be very confusing and disheartening. Right. So I just want to acknowledge in everything that I've said so far, we at Caron know that cannabis is an addictive substance that can warrant inpatient or a higher level of care. I also want to talk a little bit about what recovery looks like, because sometimes I've worked with family members who have said, like, my loved one's in sobriety from marijuana, but when they go to a 12-step meeting, they don't feel welcome. right? So I like to talk about this a little bit. And I am not a person in recovery myself, so I can't speak necessarily to meetings, but I did field out my brother and a lot of other people I know that are in recovery and kind of tried to get their perspective on what this looks like. There are different meetings. So a traditional 12-step meeting, typically the whole big book, which is the book of the founding and the principles of AA, is based on alcohol. It's based on Alcoholics Anonymous, right? I've had people tell me in recovery, you know, like my group is really about alcohol, right? And when people come in and say, I'm addicted to weed, there's people that have been sober from alcohol for 50 years and look at that and say, how are you addicted to weed, right? Because I wasn't addicted to weed. I smoked weed all the time, but really alcohol was my drug of choice. And sometimes they don't feel as welcomed, right? But it has long-standing tradition. We have a lot of success with 12-step meetings. I had a colleague who tell me that in their meeting, no one talks about their drug of choice, right? It's never discussed. So she's like, people could be in my meeting, and I've been going to that meeting for 20 years. People could be in there for marijuana, and we don't talk about drug of choice because that's not relevant. We just talk about the steps. Doesn't matter what you're getting sober from, right? So it really just depends on the meeting. So at Caron, that's why we encourage attendance in lots of different meetings so that you can find the right meeting fit for you, right? So if you go to a meeting and feel ostracized for being just a marijuana user, that's not the right meeting, right? And sometimes that takes multiple meetings. It's like dating. You got to keep trying until you find the right one. There is now a recovery support network called Marijuana Anonymous. It is specifically for marijuana, so everyone in that group is specifically there for marijuana. They do have virtual options, which is nice. However, they do have very limited in-person meetings, okay? So like I looked in my area and I'm about an hour and a half from the closest meeting that's in person. But that doesn't mean that couldn't be doable for some people if they really wanted a meeting that's specifically focused on marijuana. NA, or Narcotics Anonymous, is also a long history, has a lot of success, a lot of meeting open, and a lot of times we've heard that they might be more open to cannabis because it's a distinction in substances versus alcohol, where AA is maybe more focused on alcohol. So again, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this because I think the recovery piece is also important, because I've heard people in recovery say like, it feels more challenging with marijuana. Okay. So the last thing I really want to talk about is how do we talk to someone who's using cannabis? How do we talk to someone without getting in a power struggle, right? In terms of their cannabis use. And this could be a presentation in itself, but I like to talk about the stages of change because these are really what we look at when we look at treatment, right? So we look at where is someone in their desire to change. Right? And we look at these different stages. So this comes from Prochaska and Di Clemente's theoretical model of change. And they actually looked at people who were trying to quit smoking. And they looked at the smoking cigarettes. They looked at the different stages that they moved through based on stages of change. So we start up here in this pre-contemplation stage. And if we're in pre-contemplation, that's the stage where we don't even think what we're doing is a problem. Right. And a lot of times when I meet specifically with students, they're in this stage, right? They're like, why do I have to meet with you? I was smoking weed. It's not a big deal. It's just weed. It's legal anyway. And that's where I know they're in pre-contemplation. They're not even thinking about making a change. Contemplation is where someone says, you know, it might be good for me to quit because I got in trouble. Right? Or I got a DUI, or I got suspended, or I got kicked out of college, or something like that. But I'm not quite there yet, right? Contemplation, I always say, is that ambivalence. Like, I know I should, but I'm going to tell you every reason why it's impossible or I can't, right? That's contemplation. Preparation is like, I'm going to do it. I'm just not there. I'm not doing it yet, but like I'm planning, right? I always say like preparation might be like making the membership, to getting a membership at a gym, but I haven't gone yet, right? Like I'm getting there, but I'm not quite there yet. Action is like, I'm going to the gym 3 times a week, right? And maintenance is when I do that action for 6 months or more, right? And we're looking at maintenance, and this is why Caron is so big on recovery community upon leaving treatment and long-term levels of care and treatment. So stepping down, because the longer we can keep you connected, the longer we can keep you in a support network, we know the chances of recovery are much higher. Because if you're in treatment for 28 days, but we're saying maintenance takes 6 months, that's a big difference, right? So what are we doing in those other 5 months? Relapse, you'll see this relapse as its own phase. It could be a part of the equation. It's not for everyone. I like to say that because some people will say like relapse is part of the process. It doesn't have to be, right? There are people who've been clean for 30 years and have never relapsed. There's people who have, right? Relapse, we kind of always say is part of maintenance. It can be there. It doesn't have to be there. So what I often think about when I think about the stages of change is when we see a change needing to happen in someone else, we are wondering why they're not in action. But for ourselves, we know change is hard, right? So if I asked all of you to take a couple minutes and think of, or a couple seconds, and think of a change you've thought about making in your life, right? Whether that's eating healthier, working out, going for a walk every day, career change, relationship change, quitting smoking, right? If you think about the first time you thought about that change until you actually made that change, how much time passed? Okay. Oftentimes it's not one conversation. Oftentimes it's not one person saying, hey, I think you should maybe work out more, right? Oftentimes it takes us years to make that change. But yet when we see a change needing to happen in someone else, we assume it's going to be instantaneous. So always there's some grace period there. So the question is, though, if we have someone in pre-contemplation, how do we can move them at least to contemplation, right? So we use something in treatment, but you don't need to be a clinician to do what we call motivational interviewing. I always say motivational interviewing is like a dance you do with someone, right? If you're a parent of any kind, we do this all the time, right? We ask questions that maybe are more open-ended, and we listen for what we call change talk. So when I talk to someone about their cannabis use and I ask them questions like, are you generally happy in your life and relationships? Right? Is my child progressing? Or do you feel like you're progressing at the same timeline as your friends? Are you concerned about your cannabis use? Right? And sometimes we might get someone say like, nope, not at all. Or we might get, no, well, maybe I use more than my friends, but that's not really a big deal, right? If you saw in there, that second response was slightly different. There was a slight change, a slight glimmer of some ambivalence, right? Maybe it is more than I thought. Maybe I am using more than someone else, right? And we try to capitalize on that change talk, right? Maybe my asthma symptoms would be better if I didn't smoke. Maybe my anxiety has increased. I often work with people who will say like, I had anxiety before using cannabis, and then I used cannabis to help with my anxiety, but now I got in trouble at school, so my anxiety is heightened. So now I'm using more cannabis to deal with the increased anxiety, and they can kind of start to see that cycle, right? Of like, what came first and how do I deal with this, right? So that right there is some ambivalence, and we try to capitalize on that. Right. And some of the way we capitalize on it is we call it the darn cat, right? It's just an acronym to remember, right? And this is kind of how we reflect back to people. So we elicit a desire for change. Why would you want to do that? Oftentimes, especially with adolescents, for me, when I talk to adolescents, they'll say like, honestly, the student I had today said like, I was like, what's your relationship like with your mom? And he was like, all she does is yell at me. Like I wake up, I get dressed, I get yelled at. I come downstairs, I eat breakfast, I get yelled at. I walk out the door to school, I get yelled at, right? Whether that's reality or not, that was his perception, right? So instead of, criticizing or saying, hey, you need to change this, what would it look like if you didn't use cannabis, right? We try to elicit an ability to change. How could you go about that? What might that look like if you didn't talk to that friend? Or what might it look like if you didn't use cannabis for one day or an hour, right? Or one night? Reasons to change. What are your reasons? Elicit a need to change. How important is it to you? Right? And we can do all these things for ourselves too when we need to change, right? Ask ourselves these same questions, right? And then we want to elicit a commitment. What will you do? So I do these things every single day with students, right? I do them with parents, right? What is your next step? I'll often ask. What are you going to do next? Right? Elicit an action. What does that look like? Right? So you're going to ask for help. What does that look like? Right? And then allow them to take steps, right? So I noticed that you did this. What's the next step? Right? So we're trying to create kind of that ladder to change. And this can be incredibly frustrating, right? Because as a loved one who's seeing someone potentially make choices, potentially, make choices that are so out of character for them because their disease has kind of rewired those morals and values, it can be really difficult to take a step back and ask them questions like this instead of saying, you need to change, right? But so that's why I put this in here. Because one of the things we can at least start with is some change talk. Right? So I also just wanted to share some resources with you as some real tangibles. The Partnership to End Addiction has phenomenal research on cannabis, National Institute on Drug Abuse, or NIDA, as well. Smart Approaches to Marijuana, I put a couple graphics in there from them. Smart Approaches to Marijuana really works with the legalization movement to say, like, hold your horses. We're putting the cart before the horse right now in terms of legalization, and we need to take a step back. They do a lot of advocacy around that. So the SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. I also wanted to put in here an organization and an app called Clear 30. This actually just came out. It's really positioned for people over the age of 18. However, Clear 30 was developed by the previous CEO of the Partnership to End Addiction. And basically, it's an app that provides support for 30 days, saying, can you stop using marijuana for 30 days? Because the science and the research shows us that if people stop for 30 days, they're more likely to stop completely because they do notice that maybe they feel better. They notice that maybe they were using more than they thought. They notice that maybe their anxiety decreases. So using that research, they created an app called Clear 30. There is, I think, a slight charge. I want to say it's like $10 a month or something like that. But it provides support through text messaging. It provides like an app where you can track how much you're not using. And basically you're pledging to say, I'm not going to use for 30 days. And so that's just something that I think is really interesting as a way to kind of say, like, hey, even if you don't want to quit forever, we can try this. So I did, again, put all of my references in here to all those studies that I referenced for you as well, because I just wanted you to have them. And before I stop sharing here, I'm going to stop recording.